Kek-7 floated in his chair aboard the research ship Silent Observer, reading the assignment details on his screen. The blue text glowed softly in the dim light of his cabin. Another war documentation job, just like hundreds he had done before, across the galaxy. This time, the subject was a species called humans from a small planet called Earth. The briefing seemed simple enough. Humans were a young species that had recently been discovered by the Galactic Collective's scout ships. They lived on a blue and green world in what the galaxy maps called Sector 7 Alpha. The interesting thing about humans was that they fought wars constantly. They had been fighting each other for thousands of their years. Kek-7 had seen many species fight. The Draknari fought over territory. The Veltans fought over resources. The Zephyrians, his own people, had fought wars over trade routes. But according to the files, humans seemed to fight over ideas. They fought over invisible lines on maps. They fought over who controlled what resources. They fought over beliefs that existed only in their minds. The High Command wanted footage of human warfare for their military archives. Young officers in the Collective's academy would study these battles to understand primitive combat techniques. The assignment looked boring to Kek-7, but it paid well. He would work with his camera operator, Vith-2, who had been his partner for over 20 standard years. Vith-2 entered the cabin carrying 2 cups of hot beverage. The smaller alien handed 1 cup to Kek-7 and settled into the chair next to him. Vith-2's large eyes showed curiosity as he looked at the assignment files. "So we're going to watch primitives fight with metal sticks?" Vith-2 asked, his voice carrying a slight electronic tone from his translator device. "Projectile weapons, mostly," Kek-7 replied, scrolling through the technical data. "Some explosive devices. Their technology level is very basic. They still use chemical propulsion for their spacecraft." Vith-2 made a sound that was like laughing. "Chemical propulsion? How do they even leave their planet's surface?" "Barely," Kek-7 said. "The files show they have only just started exploring their own star system. Most of their conflicts happen on their planet's surface." The 2 aliens spent the next few hours studying human warfare data. The files contained images of human soldiers carrying simple weapons. Metal tubes that fired small metal pieces at high speed. Larger devices that threw explosive shells over long distances. Vehicles with thick armor and large guns. Everything looked crude to Kek-7. The Collective's weapons used energy beams that could cut through any material. Their ships could destroy entire planets from orbit. Human weapons looked like toys that children might play with. "The High Command thinks this will take how long?" Vith-2 asked. 3 planetary rotations, maybe 4, Kek-7 replied. "Just enough time to get good footage of their basic tactics. Charge forward, shoot weapons, retreat when losing. Standard primitive behavior." The Silent Observer dropped out of hyperspace, near Earth 2 days later. The planet looked peaceful from orbit. Blue oceans covered most of the surface. White clouds swirled in beautiful patterns. Green and brown land masses broke up the blue like islands. It was actually quite pretty for such a violent world. Kek-7 and Vith-2 prepared their equipment in the ship's main observation bay. Advanced cloaking technology would make them invisible to human detection methods. Their cameras could record from great distances without being seen. They could even slow down time during recording to capture fast-moving action. "Where should we start?" Vith-2 asked, checking the camera settings. Kek-7 studied the current conflict data streaming to their ship's computers. Several wars were happening on the planet's surface at the same time. The largest seemed to be something humans called World War II. It involved most of the major human populations fighting in 2 large groups. "Here," Kek-7 said, pointing to a location on the planet's eastern continent. "The humans call this place Stalingrad. The fighting there is very intense right now. It should give us good examples of their combat techniques." The Silent Observer moved into position above the battle zone. Through their sensors, Kek-7 could see the city below. Smoke rose from hundreds of fires. Buildings had been reduced to broken walls and rubble piles. Human soldiers moved through the ruins like insects crawling through a destroyed nest. "Look at all that destruction," Vith-2 said softly. "They are destroying their own city to fight over it." "Primitive thinking," Kek-7 replied. They probably do not understand the cost of rebuilding. The two aliens activated their cloaking field and descended toward the battle zone. Their ship became invisible as it moved through the thick smoke. The sounds of the battle grew louder as they got closer. Sharp cracking sounds from human firearms, deep booming sounds from their artillery, shouting voices in several human languages. Kex 7 began recording as they reached the optimal observation height. Through his camera, he could see human soldiers moving between the ruined buildings. They wore thick clothes and metal helmets. They carried those simple projectile weapons the files had described. Begin documentation log, Stalingrad Combat Zone. Day 1. Kex 7 spoke into his recording device. Subjects appear to be using standard primitive tactics. Small groups advancing through cover, firing projectile weapons at enemy positions. But as Kex 7 watched more closely, he noticed something strange. The human soldiers were not retreating when they took casualties. When one of them fell, the others did not run away. Instead, they moved forward more aggressively. They seemed to become more dangerous when their companions were hurt. Are you seeing this? Vith 2 asked, adjusting the camera focus. Yes, Kex 7 replied, watching a group of human soldiers charge across open ground toward an enemy position. Several of them fell to enemy fire, but the rest kept running. They reached the enemy position and began fighting with knives attached to their weapons. Why are they not retreating? Vith 2 asked. They have taken 50% casualties. Any rational species would withdraw. Kex 7 did not answer immediately. He was watching one human soldier in particular. The soldier's uniform marked him as American, though he was fighting alongside soldiers from another human nation. The name tape on his uniform read, Murphy. This Murphy human had been shot in the arm, but he was still fighting. He was using his wounded arm to hold his weapon steady, while he fired at enemies with his good arm. Maybe they do not understand tactical withdrawal, Kex 7 said finally. But even as he said it, he was not sure. The humans seemed to understand tactics very well. They used cover effectively. They coordinated their attacks. They just did not seem to know when to quit. As the day continued, Kex 7 recorded hours of footage. Every scene showed the same strange behavior. Humans fighting in conditions that should have made them surrender. Fighting when wounded. Fighting when outnumbered. Fighting when any logical species would have given up. This is going to be more interesting than we thought, Vith 2 said as they prepared to return to the ship. Kex 7 reviewed the day's footage on his personal screen that evening. Something about human warfare was different from what he expected. These were not simple primitives with crude weapons. These were something else entirely. He made a note in his mission log. Human combat behavior shows unexpected persistence. Further observation required. The second day of observation began before dawn in the human city of Stalingrad. Kex 7 and Vith 2 positioned their cloaked ship above a section of the city where the fighting had been heaviest. The temperature readings showed conditions far below what most species could survive in. Yet the humans continued to fight. Kex 7 focused his camera on a human soldier named Jake Murphy. The soldier had volunteered to fight alongside the defending forces, even though he came from a different human nation, thousands of distance units away. This puzzled Kex 7. Why would a human travel so far to fight in someone else's war? Jake Murphy and his unit were defending a building that had been reduced to broken walls and scattered rubble. They had been in the same position for 6 human days. They had no proper food, only small portions of bread and thin soup. Their clothing was torn and dirty. Several soldiers showed signs of injury, yet none had requested evacuation. Subject Murphy appears to be suffering from exposure and malnutrition. Kex 7 spoke into his recording device, yet he continues combat operations without complaint. Through his enhanced vision, Kex 7 could see that Jake Murphy's lips were blue from cold. The human's hands shook when he handled his weapon. Ice had formed on his eyebrows and facial hair. Any Zephyrian in such conditions would have entered survival hibernation immediately. The enemy attacked the building at midday. Kex 7 recorded as hundreds of soldiers charged across the open ground toward Jake Murphy's position. The defenders opened fire with their simple projectile weapons. Many attackers fell, but more kept coming. They are outnumbered 3-1, Vith 2 observed, checking the tactical display. Standard protocol would be immediate retreat. Instead, Jake Murphy and his companions fought harder. When their ammunition ran low, they used knives attached to their weapons. When those broke, they fought with entrenching tools and even rocks from the rubble. One soldier, whose name tape read Collins, continued fighting after taking a projectile wound to his chest. Keck 7 watched in growing confusion as Lieutenant Pete Collins organized a counterattack while bleeding from his wound. The human officer led his soldiers in a charge out of the ruined building, screaming what sounded like battle cries. They crashed into the attacking force with an intensity that made Keck 7's skin crawl. "This is not rational behavior," Vith 2 said, his voice carrying a tremor. "They are fighting as if surrender is not an option." "Maybe they do not understand the concept," Keck 7 replied, but he was starting to doubt his own words. The camera captured something that made both aliens feel sick. A female soldier named Lisa Kane had been surrounded by enemy troops. Instead of surrendering, she pulled the pin from an explosive device and held it close to her body. She looked the enemy soldiers in the eyes and smiled before the device exploded. Vith 2 made a choking sound. Did she just choose death over capture? Keck 7 replayed the footage in slow motion. Yes, the human female had deliberately chosen to die rather than be taken prisoner. She had not hesitated. She had not shown fear. She had smiled. "Make a note," Keck 7 said quietly. "Humans appear to prefer death to defeat." As the day continued, they observed more disturbing behavior. Human soldiers shared their last food with wounded companions. They carried injured friends through dangerous ground instead of leaving them behind. They volunteered for suicide missions without being ordered to do so. The most disturbing scene came in the evening. A group of soldiers had been trapped in a basement for 3 days without food or water. When they finally broke out instead of retreating to safety, they immediately joined another attack. Their leader, a sergeant whose uniform was torn and bloody, told his men that they would show these bastards what Americans are made of. Keck 7 did not understand the phrase, but the intent was clear. Even after days of suffering, the humans wanted to fight more, not less. "I need to understand this better," Keck 7 told Vith 2. "Access the human communication networks. Find out what they are saying to each other." Vith 2 activated the ship's translation systems and tuned into human radio frequencies. The conversations they heard made both aliens feel uncomfortable. Human commanders were not threatening their soldiers or forcing them to fight. Instead, the soldiers were asking for permission to attack. They were volunteering for dangerous missions. They were competing with each other to see who could kill more enemies. One radio conversation particularly disturbed Keck 7. A human pilot whose aircraft had been damaged was reporting to his commander. The pilot's voice was calm, almost cheerful, as he described his situation. "Engine is on fire, control surface is damaged, but I've got enough altitude for one more pass at that tank column. Request permission to continue the attack." "Negative. Return to base immediately," came the reply. "Sir, with respect, I can take out at least 3 more targets before I have to bail out. Request permission to continue." The pilot was asking permission to almost certainly die so he could destroy a few more enemy vehicles. The commander eventually agreed, and the pilot's cheerful "Thank you, sir," made Vith 2 cover his face with his hands. "They enjoy this," Vith 2 whispered. "They actually enjoy the fighting." Keck 7 was beginning to reach the same conclusion. These humans did not fight because they had to. They did not fight because they were forced to. They fought because something inside them wanted to fight. Something that made them stronger when they should be weaker, more aggressive when they should be more cautious. Late that night, Keck 7 observed a small group of human soldiers preparing for what they called a night raid. The mission was extremely dangerous and probably unnecessary. The target was an enemy outpost that could have been bypassed easily, but the soldiers had requested permission to attack it. Their leader, Corporal Mary Stewart, explained the mission to her team. Her voice showed excitement, not fear. She described the enemy positions, the approach route, and the escape plan. Then she asked if anyone wanted to volunteer for the most dangerous part of the mission. Every soldier raised his hand. Kek-7 watched through his night vision cameras as the humans crawled through a minefield to reach the enemy position. They moved, with skill and patience avoiding the buried explosives. When they reached their target, they attacked with overwhelming violence and precision. The raid was successful, but that was not what disturbed Kek-7. What disturbed him was that the humans had not needed to do it. They had chosen to do it because they wanted to hurt their enemies. They had risked their lives for no strategic purpose except the pleasure of killing. "I think we need to expand our observation," Kek-7 told Vith-2 as they returned to their ship. "This is not normal warfare. This is something else." Vith-2 was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "What if they are not fighting for territory or resources? What if they are fighting because fighting is what they do?" The question haunted Kek-7 as he prepared his daily report. He had expected to document primitive tactics and crude weapons. Instead, he was documenting a species that seemed to have turned warfare into an art form. A species that fought not because they had to, but because something deep inside them needed to fight. He ended his report with a note that would have seemed impossible just 2 days earlier. "Human warfare capabilities may exceed initial estimates. Recommend extended observation period." As he settled down to rest, Kek-7 could still hear the sounds of battle from the city below. The humans were fighting through the night, in conditions that would kill most species. And they were singing while they did it. Kek-7 realized that to truly understand human warfare, he needed to observe different theaters of their global conflict. The silent observer moved across the planet to what humans called the Pacific Theater, where another type of warfare was taking place on small islands scattered across a vast ocean. The first island they observed was barely a few square kilometers of sand, rock, and sparse vegetation. According to human military communications, the island had no strategic value except as a stepping stone to other islands. Yet thousands of humans were fighting and dying for control of this tiny piece of land. Captain Ray Johnson led a unit of human Marines in an assault on the island's northern beach. Kek-7 focused his cameras on the captain as he waded through chest-deep water while enemy fire rained down from hidden positions. The logical action would have been to retreat and find a safer landing site. Instead, Captain Johnson urged his soldiers forward into the gunfire. "Move, move, move!" the captain shouted over the sound of explosions. "They can't kill all of us." The statement horrified Vith-2. "Can't kill all of us? Is that their strategy? To absorb casualties until the enemy runs out of ammunition?" Kek-7 watched as Marine after Marine fell in the shallow water, their blood turning the ocean red. But the survivors did not retreat. They moved forward more aggressively, as if the deaths of their companions had made them angry instead of afraid. On the beach, the fighting became even more disturbing. Kek-7 observed a female soldier named Corporal Mary Stewart crawling forward on her belly while explosions threw dirt and rock into the air around her. She was not advancing toward a tactical objective. She was crawling toward a wounded companion who had fallen in an open area. "She will almost certainly die attempting that rescue," Vith-2 observed, checking the tactical probability calculations. "The wounded soldier is probably dead already," Kek-7 added. "The logical action is to leave him and continue the mission." But Corporal Stewart continued crawling forward. Enemy bullets kicked up sand inches from her head. A mortar shell exploded, close enough to cover her with debris. She kept moving until she reached the wounded Marine. Then, incredibly, she began dragging him back toward friendly lines while under continuous fire. Both Marines somehow survived the journey back to safety. But what disturbed Kek-7 most was not that they lived, but that other Marines immediately volunteered to make similar rescue attempts for other wounded soldiers. They were not ordered to do this. They chose to do it. Note for the record, Kek-7 spoke into his recording device. Human soldiers will risk certain death to recover wounded companions, even when the tactical benefit is zero. The battle for the island continued for 6 human days. Kek-7 documented dozens of examples of behavior that defied military logic. Human soldiers like Private Tony Adams held defensive positions alone against overwhelming odds when retreat would have been tactically sound. They fought in caves and tunnels where the advantage clearly belonged to the defenders. They used weapons and tactics that put them at greater risk, but gave them better chances to harm the enemy. On the 4th day, Keck 7 observed something that made him question everything he thought he knew about warfare. A group of Marines had been surrounded in a cave system for over 24 hours. They had no food, little water, and were running out of ammunition. Any rational species would have surrendered. Instead, the Marines began planning a breakout attack. Their leader, Sergeant Bill Murphy, gathered his remaining soldiers around a crude map drawn in the cave dirt. "Gentlemen," Sergeant Murphy said, his voice calm despite their desperate situation, "we're going to go out there and kill as many of those sons of bitches as we can before they get us. Any questions?" No one had questions. They all nodded and began checking their weapons. They were not planning to escape. They were planning to die while causing maximum damage to their enemies. The breakout attack was a symphony of controlled violence. The Marines burst from the cave like predators unleashed from a cage. They moved with coordination and precision, but also with a savage joy that made Keck 7's skin crawl. They fought as if death was not something to be avoided, but something to be embraced if it came with the promise of taking enemies with them. Miraculously, most of the Marines survived the breakout, but their first action after reaching safety was not to rest or tend their wounds. It was to request permission to attack another enemy position. "I need to see more," Keck 7 told Vith 2. "This behavior cannot be limited to combat soldiers. There must be logical humans somewhere." They shifted their observation to human industrial centers, thinking they would find more rational behavior among non-combatants. What they found was even more disturbing. Entire cities had been converted into weapons factories. Humans who were too old or too young to fight were working around the clock to produce instruments of war. Factory supervisor Helen Price worked 18-hour shifts coordinating the production of artillery shells. She had not seen her family in weeks because she was too busy making weapons. "The remarkable thing," Keck 7 noted in his log, "is that these civilian humans appear to be voluntarily working these schedules. No guards are forcing them. They are choosing to sacrifice their personal comfort for the war effort." In another factory, engineer Bill Murphy was designing improvements to anti-aircraft guns. The human had been working for 72 consecutive hours on a new targeting system. When asked by his supervisor if he needed rest, he replied that he would rest when the war was over. "They have turned their entire civilization into a war machine," Vith 2 observed. "Every human, regardless of age or profession, is contributing to the conflict." The industrial capacity was staggering. Humans were producing weapons, vehicles, aircraft, and ships at a rate that impressed even Keck 7's advanced civilization. But more disturbing was their innovation. Human engineers were constantly improving their weapons, making them more efficient at killing. Keck 7 documented a meeting where human scientists discussed new types of explosives. The conversation was technical and clinical, but the subject matter was how to kill more effectively. These humans spoke of death and destruction the way Keck 7's people spoke of art or philosophy. "The new design should increase casualty radius by 30%, one scientist explained cheerfully. "Excellent," replied another. "What about the shrapnel pattern? Can we make it more effective against personnel in trenches?" The casual tone of the conversation chilled both aliens. These humans were not reluctant warriors forced into conflict. They were a species that had embraced warfare as a fundamental part of their existence. That evening, Keck 7 observed a human religious gathering in one of the factories. Workers had gathered to listen to a spiritual leader speak about the war. The alien expected to hear prayers for peace or pleas to end the conflict. Instead, the human leader asked his God to bless their weapons and grant them victory over their enemies. "We ask you to guide our bombers to their targets," the religious leader prayed. "Help our soldiers to be brave and our weapons to be true. Give us the strength to defeat those who would destroy our way of life." The workers responded with enthusiastic agreement. They were praying for divine assistance in killing their enemies more effectively. "They have made warfare into a religious duty," Vith 2 whispered. "They believe their God wants them to fight." Keck 7 reviewed the day's footage as they returned to orbit. Every scene showed the same pattern. Humans did not simply accept warfare as a necessity. They had transformed it into the central organizing principle of their entire civilization. Every aspect of human society was designed to make them more effective at fighting. "This is not a species that happens to be at war," Kek-7 said finally. "This is a species that exists to make war." Vith too was quiet for a long time, then he asked, "What happens when they finish fighting each other?" The question sent a chill through Kek-7's body. What would a species this dedicated to warfare do when they ran out of enemies on their own planet? The answer seemed obvious, and it terrified him. "We need to observe more," he told Vith too. "We need to understand exactly what we are dealing with." Kek-7 decided that understanding human warfare required observing it across time. Their advanced technology allowed them to observe different periods of human history without interfering with the timeline. He needed to see if the disturbing behavior they had documented was unique to this particular war, or if it represented something fundamental about the human species. The silent observer jumped backward in time to what humans called the Korean War. The technology was slightly more advanced, but the behavior patterns were identical. Captain Steve Rogers led his soldiers in an attack on an enemy position in conditions that made Stalingrad look comfortable. The temperature was far below freezing. Snow fell steadily from a gray sky. The soldiers wore heavy clothing, but Kek-7 could see their breath in the cold air. They had been fighting for weeks with minimal supplies and inadequate rest. Any rational species would have requested relief or negotiated a temporary ceasefire. Instead, Captain Rogers gathered his soldiers for another assault on an enemy stronghold. His orders were simple. "We're going to take that hill, and we're going to hold it. Any questions?" The soldiers had no questions. They checked their weapons and prepared for another charge into enemy fire. Kek-7 noticed that several soldiers were wounded from previous battles, yet none had requested evacuation. They fought with bandages covering their injuries, refusing to leave their companions. The same patterns Vith too observed, watching the attack through their cameras. Different war, same behavior. They fight beyond the point of logic. The attack succeeded, but at enormous cost. More than half the soldiers were casualties. The survivors immediately began preparing defensive positions, assuming the enemy would counterattack. They did not celebrate their victory or rest from their efforts. They simply prepared for the next phase of fighting. Kek-7 jumped forward to the Vietnam conflict. Here he observed Lieutenant Amy Clark leading a patrol through jungle terrain that was actively hostile to human life. The environment itself was trying to kill them with poisonous plants, dangerous animals, and disease-carrying insects. Yet the humans adapted and continued their mission. What disturbed Kek-7 most was how quickly humans learned. Lieutenant Clark's soldiers had developed techniques for surviving in the jungle that were not in their training manuals. They created new tactics for fighting an enemy that used guerrilla warfare. They modified their weapons and equipment to work better in the humid, tropical environment. "They adapt," Kek-7 said into his recording device. "When faced with new challenges, they do not retreat or request different assignments. They learn and adapt, becoming more effective." The Vietnam observations revealed another disturbing aspect of human warfare. The soldiers were fighting an enemy they rarely saw clearly. The jungle battles were against an opponent that struck quickly and then disappeared. This should have demoralized the humans and made them less effective. Instead, it made them more creative. They developed new detection methods, new weapons, and new tactics. They turned the jungle itself into a weapon, using their engineering skills to create defensive positions that integrated with the natural environment. Kek-7 watched helicopter pilot Officer Rick Jones flying supply missions into combat zones. The human flew his aircraft through enemy fire with the same casual attitude that Kek-7 might have when flying to a peaceful planet for vacation. The pilot was not reckless, but he showed no fear of the danger. Supply dropped to Firebase Charlie. Officer Jones reported to his base over the radio. "Taking heavy ground fire, but should be able to complete the mission." "Do you need support, Corniquor?" came the reply. "Negative, just another day at the office." The pilot delivered his supplies and flew back to base while enemy projectiles traced past his aircraft. He landed, refueled, and immediately volunteered for another dangerous mission. Keck 7 jumped forward to more recent human conflicts. The technology had advanced significantly, but the fundamental patterns remained the same. Humans still fought with the same intensity, the same refusal to surrender, and the same willingness to sacrifice for their companions. In one modern conflict, Special Forces operator Sergeant Danny White was conducting operations deep in enemy territory. His mission was to gather intelligence on enemy movements. The logical approach would have been to observe from a safe distance and report what he saw. Instead, Sergeant White and his team actively disrupted enemy operations. They destroyed supply convoys, eliminated key personnel, and created chaos behind enemy lines. They were not content to simply watch the enemy. They had to fight the enemy. Note this pattern, Keck 7 told Vith 2. Across multiple conflicts and time periods, humans consistently choose aggressive action over passive observation. Even when their missions do not require combat, they seek it out. The most disturbing discovery came when Keck 7 observed human military training facilities. He expected to see instruction in basic combat techniques and weapon operation. What he found was systematic conditioning designed to override natural self-preservation instincts. At one facility, Sergeant Major Paul Tucker was training new soldiers. The methods he used would have been considered torture by any civilized species. The trainees were deprived of sleep, food, and comfort. They were forced to perform physical tasks beyond normal endurance limits. They were subjected to psychological pressure that would break most sapient beings. Yet the humans not only endured this treatment, they competed with each other to excel at it. They pushed themselves harder than their instructors demanded. They helped weaker trainees rather than allowing them to fail. They formed bonds with their fellow sufferers that seemed stronger than family relationships. They are conditioning themselves to be more effective killers, Vith 2 observed, watching recruits practice combat techniques with bayonets. More than that, Keck 7 replied. They are conditioning themselves to function as a unit. Individual, humans are dangerous, but groups of humans are exponentially more dangerous. The training video showed humans learning to operate as teams with almost telepathic coordination. They developed hand signals, verbal codes, and movement patterns that allowed them to communicate and coordinate in combat situations. They trained until these behaviors became instinctive. But the most chilling discovery was in the advanced training centers. Here, Keck 7 observed humans preparing for conflicts that did not yet exist. Air Force pilot Captain Julie Martinez was training in simulators that recreated space combat scenarios. The humans had never encountered alien species, yet they were preparing to fight them. Look at this training scenario, Vith 2 said, pointing to the simulator display. They are practicing combat against hypothetical enemies with energy weapons and advanced shielding. They are preparing for galactic warfare, Keck 7 realized. They have never met alien species, but they are already planning how to fight us. The training scenarios covered every possible combat situation. Humans practiced fighting in zero gravity, in toxic atmospheres, and in environments that no Earth creature could naturally survive. They developed weapons and tactics for enemies they had never seen. Keck 7 found military planning documents that made his blood run cold. Human strategists had developed contingency plans for fighting enemies with superior technology. They had strategies for defeating faster, stronger, and more advanced opponents. They assumed that any alien contact would eventually lead to conflict. They are not just warriors, Keck 7 said slowly. They are warrior engineers. They fight, but they also think and plan and prepare. Every battle teaches them lessons that they apply to the next battle. The most disturbing document was a theoretical analysis of galactic warfare. Human military thinkers had calculated the probable capabilities of hypothetical alien enemies. They had developed strategies for fighting opponents with faster-than-light travel, energy weapons, and advanced shielding. The analysis concluded that superior technology could be overcome through superior tactics, greater numbers, and willingness to accept casualties. The humans believed they could defeat any enemy, no matter how advanced, through determination and adaptability. We need to see their space program, Keck 7 told Vith 2. The human space facilities revealed the final piece of the puzzle, the rockets. and spacecraft were primitive by galactic standards, but they represented something far more dangerous than advanced technology. They represented human ambition reaching beyond their planet. Keck-7 observed human astronauts training for missions to other worlds in their solar system. The training was as intense and demanding as military preparation. The humans were treating space exploration as another form of warfare, requiring the same dedication and sacrifice. "They are coming," Vith-2 whispered. "They are actually planning to leave their planet." Keck-7 reviewed all their observations from multiple time periods. The pattern was clear and terrifying. Humans were not simply a warlike species. They were a species that had evolved specifically for warfare. Every aspect of their biology, psychology, and culture was optimized for conflict. "We have documented a predator species," Keck-7 said finally. "They have spent their entire evolutionary history learning to fight more effectively, and now they are preparing to bring those skills to the galaxy." Keck-7 and Vith-2 returned to contemporary Earth to observe the current state of human warfare. What they found exceeded their worst fears. Human military technology had advanced dramatically, but more disturbing was how their approach to warfare had evolved into something approaching perfection. They observed a modern special forces training facility, where operators like Sergeant Danny White were being prepared for missions that defied belief. The humans were not just training to fight other humans anymore. They were preparing for scenarios that could only involve non-human opponents. Combat in zero-gravity environments. Keck-7 read from the intercepted training documents. Tactics for fighting enemies with advanced energy weapons. Procedures for boarding hostile spacecraft. The training was beyond anything Keck-7 had seen in his documentation of galactic conflicts. These humans practiced combat in conditions that most species had never even imagined. They learned to fight while wearing bulky environmental suits. They developed techniques for combat in rotating spacecraft where gravity changed direction constantly. Sergeant Danny White led his team through a simulation that made both aliens feel sick. The scenario involved boarding an enemy vessel and fighting through corridors while dealing with advanced defensive systems. The humans treated it like a routine training exercise, discussing tactics and equipment as if they had been fighting space battles for centuries. "Breaching charge on the airlock," Sergeant White instructed his team. "Remember unknown artificial gravity, so be ready for disorientation. Enemy weapons are energy-based, so standard body armor is useless. Speed and aggression are our only advantages." The team executed the simulation flawlessly. They moved through the mock alien ship with deadly efficiency, adapting instantly to changing conditions. When they encountered simulated advanced weapons, they found ways to defeat them using primitive but effective tactics. "They are training to fight us," Vith-2 said quietly. "They are actually preparing for galactic warfare." Air Force pilot Captain Julie Martinez was practicing in flight simulators that recreated space combat with frightening accuracy. The scenarios involved fighting enemy vessels with superior technology and firepower. The human pilots developed tactics that used their spacecraft's weaknesses as advantages. "If their shields can stop our missiles," Captain Martinez explained to her wingman during a training exercise, "we ram them. Human pilots can handle acceleration forces that would kill most other species. We use that advantage." The casual way she discussed suicide attacks as viable tactics sent chills through Keck-7's body. These humans were planning to use their own biological advantages as weapons against technologically superior enemies. Keck-7 accessed human military communication networks and found planning documents that made him question whether returning to report these findings was wise. Human strategists had developed detailed plans for fighting hypothetical alien invasions. The plans assumed that alien enemies would have superior technology but might lack human adaptability and determination. Human commanders had calculated that they could defeat advanced enemies through superior numbers, willingness to accept casualties, and tactical innovation. "Enemy vessels will likely have energy shields that can deflect our current weapons," read one strategic document. "However, kinetic impact weapons moving at sufficient velocity should penetrate any defensive system. Recommend development of mass driver weapons using human-crewed projectiles." The humans were planning to use their own bodies as weapons against alien technology. They had calculated that a human pilot in a high-velocity spacecraft could penetrate any known defensive system through sheer kinetic impact. They were designing manned missiles specifically for fighting galactic opponents. "This is beyond warfare," Vith-2 whispered. "This is weaponized evolution." Kek-7 observed a meeting of human military leaders discussing something called Project Starfall. The project involved developing weapons and tactics specifically for fighting enemies from other star systems. The humans had never encountered alien species, yet they were dedicating enormous resources to preparing for galactic conflict. General Kate Morrison led the briefing with the same calm professionalism that Kek-7 had seen in human combat officers. She discussed hypothetical alien capabilities as if she had been fighting galactic wars for decades. Intelligence estimates suggest that any hostile alien force will have significant advantages in technology and individual capability, General Morrison explained. However, they will likely underestimate human adaptability and our willingness to accept casualties. Our advantage lies in doing things they will consider impossible or insane. The general outlined human strategies that were indeed impossible and insane by galactic standards. Humans planned to use their entire planet as a fortress, turning every city into a battleground. They would fight in space using tactics that no rational species would attempt. They would use their own biology as a weapon against alien technology. If they can't be defeated conventionally, the general continued, we make the cost of victory unacceptable. Every human settlement becomes a battleground. Every human civilian becomes a potential combatant. We make conquest so expensive that even victory becomes defeat. The humans were planning to turn their entire species into a weapon. They would fight using every man, woman, and child on their planet. They had calculated that their enemies would eventually give up rather than pay the enormous cost of defeating such determined resistance. Kek-7 found evidence that human scientists were already developing weapons based on theoretical alien technology. Scientist Dr. Lisa Wang was leading research into energy-based weapon systems that could only be effective against hypothetical alien enemies. If we assume enemy armor is designed to deflect energy weapons, Dr. Wang explained to her research team, we develop weapons that use their own defensive systems against them. Reflective armor becomes a vulnerability when faced with weapons designed to use reflection as part of their destructive mechanism. The humans were developing countermeasures for weapons that did not exist, defenses against enemies they had never met. They approached the problem of galactic warfare with the same systematic thoroughness they applied to fighting each other. Most disturbing was a classified document that Kek-7 found in human military networks. It was a psychological analysis of probable alien behavior patterns. Human strategists had calculated that most advanced species would be less willing to accept casualties than humans were. Galactic civilizations that have achieved interstellar travel will likely value individual life more highly than human societies do, the analysis concluded. This represents a strategic weakness that can be exploited through tactics that deliberately maximize casualties on both sides. The humans were planning to use their own casual attitude toward death as a weapon against species that valued life more highly. They calculated that alien enemies would retreat or negotiate, rather than continue fighting opponents willing to die in large numbers. Kek-7 observed training facilities where humans like Sergeant Mike Foster were learning to operate. In the vacuum of space, they practiced combat in zero gravity, using modified weapons designed for space warfare. They learned to fight while wearing bulky protective suits that limited their mobility. Standard combat doctrine does not apply in zero-G environments, Sergeant Foster explained to his trainees. But humans can adapt faster than most species to changing conditions. We use that adaptation speed as a tactical advantage. The sergeant led his team through combat exercises that took place in rotating chambers that simulated various gravity conditions. The humans learned to fight effectively, whether gravity was pulling them toward the floor, the ceiling, or changing direction every few seconds. They are preparing for every possible combat scenario, Vith-2 observed. They assume they will eventually fight enemies with every type of technology and every possible advantage. The final piece of evidence that convinced Keck 7 that humans represented a galactic threat, was found in their space program facilities. Human engineers were designing spacecraft that were not exploration vessels, but weapons platforms disguised as scientific instruments. The ships were equipped with what humans called scientific equipment that could easily be converted into weapons systems. Communication arrays that could be used as energy weapons. Mineral extraction equipment that could be used to build fortifications on other worlds. Even their astronaut life support systems could be modified into biological warfare dispersal systems. Every human space mission is a potential military deployment, Keck 7 realized. They are not exploring space. They are scouting it for future conquest. Human mission planners were already discussing permanent colonies on other worlds in their solar system. But the colony plans included detailed defensive preparations and weapons manufacture capabilities. Every human settlement would be a fortress. Every colonist, a potential soldier. We have seen enough, Keck 7 told Vith 2. We need to return to the High Command immediately. As they prepared to leave Earth's solar system, Keck 7 reviewed all their findings. The humans were not simply another warlike species. They were something unprecedented in galactic history, a species that had evolved specifically to be perfect warriors. The silent observer docked at Galactic Central Station 3 days later. Keck 7 had spent the entire journey reviewing his footage and preparing his report. What he had to tell the High Command was not the academic documentation they had requested. It was a warning that could change the future of galactic civilization. Instead of submitting his materials to the military archives as ordered, Keck 7 requested an emergency session with the High Command Council. The request was unusual enough to get immediate attention. Within 6 hours, he was standing in the Great Chamber, where the leaders of 12 species made decisions that affected trillions of lives. Chancellor Vex Prime of the Zephyrian Collective presided over the emergency session. The ancient aliens' crystalline features showed curiosity rather than concern. Around the circular chamber, representatives of the galaxy's major civilizations waited to hear why a simple documentation mission had become an emergency. War Correspondent Keck 7, Chancellor Vex Prime began. Your report was scheduled for routine submission to our military archives. Why have you requested this emergency session? Keck 7 activated his presentation system and the chamber filled with holographic displays showing scenes from Earth. The assembled representatives watched with mild interest as images of human warfare began to play. Honored Council, Keck 7 began. I was sent to document primitive combat techniques for our military academies. What I found was not primitive warfare. What I found was evolutionary perfection. The first holographic display showed Jake Murphy and his unit fighting in the ruins of Stalingrad. The aliens watched as humans continued fighting in conditions that would have killed most galactic species. These humans fight in temperatures 40 degrees below their species' normal tolerance, Keck 7 explained. They continue combat operations, while suffering from malnutrition, disease, and injuries that would incapacitate our finest warriors. Ambassador Threx of the Mantari Federation waved a dismissive appendage. Primitive species often show irrational persistence. This is not unusual. Respectfully, Ambassador, Keck 7 replied. This is not irrational persistence, this is calculated ferocity. The display shifted to show Captain Ray Johnson leading Marines in the Pacific Theater. The representatives watched as humans charged directly into enemy fire, not because they were forced to, but because they chose to. Note their facial expressions, Keck 7 pointed out. These humans are not afraid. They are excited. They enjoy the combat. They have evolved to find warfare pleasurable. Counselor Yithqua of the Serene Collective made a sound of disbelief. No rational species finds violence pleasurable. You must be misinterpreting their emotional responses. Keck 7 played audio recordings of human soldiers requesting permission for dangerous missions, volunteering for suicide attacks, and expressing disappointment when battles ended. The chamber fell silent as they heard humans laughing while under enemy fire and singing while charging into overwhelming odds. These recordings span multiple conflicts across several centuries, Keck 7 explained. The pattern is consistent across all time periods and all human cultures. They do not fight because they must. They fight because they want to. The display showed human industrial facilities converted to weapons production. The representatives watched as entire civilizations dedicated themselves to creating better ways to kill their enemies. This is their response to warfare. Keck 7 continued. They do not seek to end conflicts quickly. They transform their entire society into a weapon. Every human becomes part of their war machine. General Korth 9 of the Draconian Empire leaned forward in his seat. Their weapons appear primitive, kinetic projectiles and chemical explosives. Hardly a threat to galactic civilization. Observe this, Keck 7 said, shifting the display to show modern human military exercises. The chamber watched as Sergeant Danny White led his Special Forces team through space combat training. The humans moved through zero-gravity environments with deadly efficiency, using tactics that the galactic military had never encountered. They are training for galactic warfare, Keck 7 announced. They have never encountered alien species, yet they are preparing to fight us. The display showed human spacecraft designs that were obviously weapons platforms disguised as exploration vessels. It showed human colonies planned as military fortresses. It showed human scientists developing countermeasures for alien technology they had never seen. They assume that contact with galactic civilization will eventually lead to conflict, Keck 7 explained. And they intend to win that conflict. Chancellor Vex Prime studied the holographic displays with growing concern. These preparations could be defensive in nature. Many species prepare for hypothetical threats. Chancellor, observe this strategic document, Keck 7 said, displaying a human military analysis. The chamber fell silent as they read human plans for fighting galactic enemies. The plans assumed alien technological superiority, but calculated that human determination and casualty tolerance could overcome any advantage. They plan to use our reluctance to accept casualties against us, Keck 7 explained. They have calculated that we will retreat or negotiate rather than pay the price of defeating determined resistance. Ambassador Threx made a scoffing sound. One primitive planet against the entire galactic collective? The mathematics make victory impossible. Do they? Keck 7 asked. Let me show you something else. The display showed human population statistics and industrial capacity. The numbers were staggering. Billions of humans living on one world, with manufacturing capabilities that rivaled some galactic civilizations. They have 8 billion individuals on their home world, Keck 7 announced. Every one of them can be trained for combat. Their industrial capacity can be converted to weapons production within months. They represent the largest standing army in galactic history. The mathematical reality began to sink in around the chamber. 8 billion warriors. Each one conditioned from birth to view warfare as natural and necessary. Each one willing to die rather than surrender. Each one trained to adapt and innovate in combat situations. Furthermore, Keck 7 continued, they are already expanding beyond their home world. Human colonies are being established throughout their solar system. Each colony is designed as a fortress. Each colonist is a potential soldier. The display showed human plans for interstellar travel. The designs were primitive but functional. More importantly, they were obviously designed for military purposes rather than peaceful exploration. Within 50 galactic cycles, humans will have interstellar capability, Keck 7 predicted. When that happens, they will begin expanding throughout the galaxy. Not as explorers or traders, but as conquerors. Counselor Yithka raised an objection. The Galactic Collective has maintained peace for over 1,000 cycles. Surely these humans can be integrated into our peaceful civilization. Counselor, Keck 7 replied, humans do not have a word in their language that means peaceful defeat. In every human language, surrender is considered worse than death. They cannot be integrated because they cannot be conquered. The display showed human prisoners of war who had continued fighting even while captured. It showed human civilians who had resisted occupation forces for decades. It showed human children being trained in combat techniques as soon as they could walk. They are not just warriors, Keck 7 explained. They are a warrior species. Every human is bred, trained, and conditioned for warfare from birth. They represent the ultimate evolution of military capability. General Korth 9 studied the tactical displays with professional interest. Their individual capabilities appear formidable, but surely advanced technology can overcome primitive determination. General, observe this training exercise, Keck 7 said. The display showed human forces defeating simulated enemies with superior technology through superior tactics and willingness to accept casualties. The humans use their own primitive weapons to turn advanced defenses against themselves. They have developed countermeasures for every known form of galactic technology, Keck 7 explained. Energy shields, advanced sensors, automated defense systems. They have found weaknesses in technologies they have never encountered. The chamber watched as human engineers demonstrated weapons designed to exploit the physics principles behind galactic technology. The weapons were crude but effective, turning advanced systems into vulnerabilities. They approach warfare as engineering problem, Keck 7 continued. Every defense can be defeated. Every advantage can be countered. Every enemy can be killed if you are willing to pay the price. Chancellor Vex Prime stood slowly, studying the holographic displays with obvious concern. War Correspondent Keck 7, what do you recommend? Honored Chancellor, Keck 7 replied, I recommend that Earth be designated as a protected world with a permanent quarantine zone. No galactic civilization should make contact with humans until we can determine how to coexist with a species that views warfare as a natural state. Quarantine? Ambassador Threx objected. That seems excessive for one primitive world. Ambassador, Keck 7 said quietly, we are not quarantining one primitive world. We are quarantining the most dangerous predator species in galactic history, a species that has spent millions of years perfecting the art of warfare, a species that is now preparing to bring those skills to the galaxy.